They say the desert doesn't care who you are, only whether you can survive it. But sometimes in the cruelest heat and silence, something unexpected happens. Not a gunshot, not a thunderstorm, just a small act of kindness that echoes louder than war drums. Fletcher Knox wasn't a hero, not in the way stories like to dress men up after the fact. He was just a cowboy, 34, sunburnt, solitary, and stubborn. His only real possession was a tired ranch and a battered sense of right and wrong that hadn't quite rusted out yet. And on one scorched afternoon, as the Arizona sun cracked the earth like broken porcelain, he did something that changed everything. He gave away his last piece of bread. No questions, no bargains, just bread. To a starving Apache boy crouched behind a rock, too weak to run, too proud to beg. He didn't know the child's name. Didn't know that the whip marks across his back were carved by the hands of a war chief. Didn't know that 200 warriors were already tracking the boy's scent. And he sure as hell didn't know that by nightfall, his quiet ranch would be surrounded by silence so heavy it could crack bone, the kind of silence only warriors carry before the storm. But that's the thing about kindness. It never announces its consequences. This is the story of what happened next. Of how one cowboy found himself between two worlds, one demanding blood, the other begging for mercy. Of a child marked for greatness, and a man who'd long forgotten what it meant to believe in anything but survival. And how together, they rewrote a destiny carved in bone and tradition. So lean in close. Because in the West, it's never the bullet that changes everything. It's the moment before someone decides whether to pull the trigger at all. The bread was stale, dry enough to crack at the edges when Fletcher broke it in half, and hard enough that a city man might have tossed it to the birds. But out here in the Arizona heat, where every dollar mattered and every crumb came from sweat, even hard bread was a gift. Fletcher Knox sat on the edge of his fence line that morning, boots planted in dust, a coil of barbed wire at his side, and silence stretching for miles. He wasn't the kind of man who expected company, let alone strangers crawling out from the brush, with ribs showing through their skin. But that's exactly what the desert gave him. A boy no more than 8, crouched behind a rock like a wounded coyote, wild-eyed, shaking, and starving. The kid didn't say a word, just stared. There was something too old in those eyes, something hollow, like hope had packed up and left days ago. Fletcher didn't reach for his gun, didn't bark or threaten or try to scare him off. He simply pulled that dry piece of bread from his saddlebag, walked slow, and placed it on the rock between them. Then he stepped back. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then the boy lunged, not with violence but desperation, and devoured the bread in seconds, hands, shaking, eyes glistening. And in that moment, Fletcher felt something shift. Not in the ground, not in the wind, but in him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't walk away, not after seeing that. So he pointed toward his cabin, to food, to water, to shelter. The boy hesitated. Trust doesn't come easy when the world has whipped it out of you. But hunger beat fear that day, and the child followed. Inside the cabin, Fletcher warmed a pot of beans and set out some cornbread. The boy sat near the door, one leg trembling, one eye on the exit. Fletcher didn't press, just watched him eat. Every bite looked like it hurt and healed him all at once. His small body flinched with every creak of the wood, every gust of wind. It wasn't just his belly that was empty. It was his entire sense of safety. And when Fletcher saw the raised welts across the boy's back, old and angry, like lightning scars, his jaw clenched. Someone had done this. Someone had looked at this child and chosen pain. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He just handed the boy a blanket that smelled of saddle oil and cedar, pointed toward a soft patch near the fire, and let him sleep. But what Fletcher didn't know was that kindness in a land soaked with suspicion comes at a cost. 20 miles away, warriors were riding hard, not because the boy was lost, but because he had been taken from someone with power, with law, with blood ties that ran deeper than water. And as the boy slept soundly for the first time in days, Fletcher looked out at the moon-soaked desert and whispered to no one, "Lord, what have I brought into my home?" The answer would come with the sunrise. The morning came quiet. not with bird songs or wind in the grass, but with the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the cabin like a second roof. Fletcher Knox had seen many sunrises, but few felt like this. There was no peace in the golden light bleeding through the shutters, only a question he hadn't dared ask. Who was this boy, and what kind of world had carved such fear into someone so small? He stirred the beans again, half from habit, half to break the silence. The child was still sleeping, curled on his side like he was afraid to stretch out, as if even rest had to be earned in short bursts. Fletcher had given him a name in his mind, Little Shadow, because that's what he moved like, clinging to corners and slipping through sound. When the boy finally woke, there was no greeting, just wide, watching eyes. And the kind of stillness that said, "I don't trust this yet." Fletcher didn't push. Instead, he knelt and offered water in a tin cup. The boy took it with both hands, careful as if expecting it to disappear the moment he reached. And when his shirt slipped slightly from his shoulder, Fletcher saw them again, those welts thick and cruel cut in uneven lines down the boy's back. They weren't from nature. Not thorns, not accident, not the desert's hard hand. These were human, deliberate. Fletcher's gut turned. He'd known violence, sure, the kind that comes with bar fights and broken fences. But this was different. This was ritual. This was meant to scar. He tried to ask gently, softly, where the boy had come from, who had done this, but the child shrank back at every word, his small frame stiffening like a deer caught mid-step. So Fletcher stopped. He wasn't here to interrogate. He was here to protect. He spent the rest of that day doing chores, fixing a gate hinge, and hauling water, always with the boy nearby watching, but never too close. Fletcher started to notice things. The boy didn't flinch at the sound of hammers or boots, but jumped at laughter. He was scared of joy, scared of softness. And that's when Fletcher realized maybe the worst scars aren't on the back. Maybe they're in the heart, where no one can see them, but where they echo through every glance, every pause, every dream. That night, Fletcher left a bowl of beans on the table, a wool blanket folded near the fire, and turned in early. He didn't say goodnight. Didn't make the boy choose between speech and silence. He just let it be. But as he lay on his cot, half drifting towards sleep, he heard something. Not a voice, not a footstep, just a sound so soft it could have been the wind. A whisper, in broken English. From the dark, "Thank you, white man." Fletcher didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling, tears stinging behind his eyes, and whispered back into the dark, "You're safe now, kid. As long as I'm breathing." But outside, in the chill of night, the riders had almost reached his land. It wasn't the sound of hoofbeats that woke Fletcher. It was the absence of sound, the kind that makes your skin crawl before your brain catches up. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind didn't whisper. Even the cattle in the lower corral stood unnaturally still. He sat up, instinct first, logic second, and reached for his rifle. The boy Little Shadow, as Fletcher still called him in his mind, was asleep near the hearth, the blanket pulled high up to his chin. For once he didn't look afraid, just small. Fletcher moved to the window, slow and quiet, like the floorboards might betray him. And what he saw made his breath catch mid-chest. They were everywhere. Rows upon rows of Apache warriors, mounted and motionless, formed a perfect semicircle around his property. Not shouting, not threatening, just waiting. Their war paint fresh, their spears angled like sun-drenched teeth. It wasn't just a raiding party. This was ceremonial. This was judgment. For a man who'd faced droughts, rustlers, and the slow death of loneliness, nothing had ever chilled Fletcher quite like the stillness of that moment. It wasn't war yet, but it was the choice to go to war. And they had placed that choice at his front door. He stepped away from the window, heart thudding in his ears. The boy stirred and blinked toward him, confused by the tension in the air. But when Fletcher pointed toward the window, the child's face went pale. He didn't need words to understand. The boy knew. They had found him. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't run. Instead, he moved to Fletcher's side, trembling hands, clutching the hem of his shirt. "They come for me," he whispered. Fletcher didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning. If he gave the boy back, maybe he lived. Maybe not. And if he didn't, he'd signed both their death warrants. But there was no hiding now. There was no place to run. A figure on horseback began to ride slowly from the formation. Older, adorned with feathers and battle scars. Even from a distance, his presence felt heavier than the rest. The air bent around him with authority. The chief. As he drew closer, Fletcher noticed something in his hand, a coiled leather whip. Old, stained, familiar. The same kind of whip that had left the boy's back striped like a broken field. The boy whimpered and shrank behind Fletcher's leg. Fletcher's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a recovery mission. This was personal, punitive. The chief reined in 20 feet from the porch and called out, voice grave and measured, "White man, you have taken what belongs to the Apache. Return the boy and live." Fletcher stepped onto the porch, rifle lowered, but in his grip. His voice was calm but tight. "He came to me starving, hurt. I gave him bread, that's all." A flicker, something like surprise, passed through the chief's eyes. Then stillness again. Behind Fletcher, the boy began to sob. Not from fear of death, but the familiar terror of being seen and still unwanted. Fletcher didn't know it then. But this was the moment everything would turn, not with violence, but with words. For a long breath, no one moved. Not the chief, not the warriors behind him, not even Fletcher, who stood barefoot on the porch, rifle gripped, but unraised, heart beating like a drum behind his ribs. The wind kicked up dust between them, as if the desert itself was drawing a line. The chief's voice came again, this time slower, heavier. "The boy is not just a child. He is my blood, son of my dead brother. He stole sacred corn from the winter stores and fled. He knew the punishment." Fletcher glanced behind him. The boy, little shadow, stood in the doorway, face pale but dry-eyed, and Fletcher could suddenly see it. The weight, the burden. This wasn't just a runaway. This was a boy carrying the broken bones of culture and bloodline and shame. "He's 8, Fletcher replied quietly, "and he was starving." The chief didn't flinch. "Hunger is no excuse for violating sacred law. Our ways are older than your nation. He is next in line to lead. And he must learn that a chief serves the people before himself." Fletcher's throat tightened. This wasn't just a standoff of flesh and blood. This was a collision of justice and mercy, of tradition and compassion, of survival and healing. He thought of the boy's trembling fingers around the bread, of the way he had flinched at kindness like it might be a trap, of the quiet "thank you" whispered into darkness. Could he hand that child back to a man, carrying the very whip that carved those scars? And yet, could he deny a people their right to discipline their future leader, to uphold their laws? Fletcher lowered the rifle and placed it gently against the porch railing. Then he did something no one expected. He raised his hands, open, empty palms, toward the chief. "A gesture of peace, Chief," he said, voice thick with dust and heart. "I understand this boy belongs to your people. I respect your customs. But before you take him, I ask you one thing." The chief raised an eyebrow, unmoved but listening. "Do you remember what it's like to be 8 years old and so hungry you'd steal to survive?" The old warrior's face didn't change. But he didn't speak either. That silence meant something. "I'm not asking you to forget your laws," Fletcher continued. "But maybe there's a way for him to understand those laws without breaking his spirit completely." Another long silence. Then the chief dismounted. Slowly, deliberately. As dust curled around his feet, he walked closer until there were only a few paces between them. He studied Fletcher's face like a man trying to read a language he'd never seen in print. "You speak bold," he said finally. "Most white men fear our ways. You question them." "I question pain without learning," Fletcher said. "Not your laws." The chief looked past him to the boy in the doorway, then back again. "You would have me teach him with your mercy?" the chief asked. "I would have you give him a chance to understand what he broke," Fletcher replied, "so he can grow into the chief you want him to be. Not just a scared boy with scars." The chief didn't speak, but behind him some warriors shifted. Not in anger, in thought. The moment was fragile, hung like a thread between thunderheads. And then finally the chief spoke again. "Then he will stay, for 1 moon. He will learn your ways, and then he will return to face ours." The dust hadn't even settled from the Apache war party's retreat when Fletcher Knox realized the weight of what he'd just agreed to. A full moon cycle. That's what the chief had granted. 1 month for the boy to learn the white man's ways, and perhaps more importantly, to heal. And not just from hunger or wounds, but from fear, from shame, from the silence that had wrapped around him like a second skin. Little Wolf didn't speak much at first. He watched, listened, moved like an animal, still unsure whether the trap had truly been lifted. But there was something in his gaze that shifted with each passing day, a quiet spark buried deep under all that sorrow. Fletcher started by teaching him the land, not with grand lessons or long speeches, just with daily life. How to mend a fence, how to water stock, how to listen to the wind and know when rain might come even if it rarely did. The boy was sharp in a way Fletcher hadn't expected. He didn't just mimic, he absorbed. He'd watch Fletcher once and then fix a saddle strap with nimble fingers. He learned to feed chickens, patch the barn roof, and even understood the quiet art of checking cattle for ticks or heat stroke. But more than tasks, what Fletcher hoped to teach him was presence, that it was okay to speak without trembling, that not every voice raised meant pain, that kindness didn't always come with a price. In return, Little Wolf taught too. With no lesson plans, no structure, just being. He showed Fletcher how to follow a lizard's trail in the sand, how to read the sky for omens no calendar would show. He could tell how long a rabbit had passed by the way a blade of grass bent. He moved through nature like he was part of it, not just a visitor. Their shared silences grew comfortable. Fletcher would sit on the porch come evening, sipping coffee, and the boy would sit near, legs crossed, eyes tracing the firelight across the sky. They didn't need to talk. Some days the silence was the bond. But at night, when he thought Fletcher was asleep, Little Wolf would whisper things to the stars. Bits of Apache. Names maybe. Prayers, fears, regrets. One evening as the moon rose high over the dry hills, Little Wolf finally spoke aloud. My father was warrior, brave, died with knife in hand. I steal corn. I shame him. Fletcher leaned forward, elbows on his knees, heart aching. You were hungry. That's not shame. That's need. But chiefs do not steal, the boy said. They protect. They lead. Fletcher thought a moment. Sometimes being a leader isn't about never falling. It's about learning why you did and how to rise better. The boy looked at him, then really looked. Not with fear, not with guilt, but with something close to hope. For the first time, Fletcher saw not a scared child, not a fugitive, but the flicker of a future chief. Yet neither of them knew that peace had a shorter fuse than they hoped. Because out in the distance beyond the hills and behind the law, another threat was already riding hard. One that didn't care for Apache's treaties or second chances. It was the crackle of dry brush under boot and the low snort of uneasy horses that stirred Fletcher from sleep that night. He wasn't a man prone to nerves, but the sound of riders approaching in the dark without song, without laughter, without the rhythm of travel meant something different, something dangerous. He moved without a word, rolling from his cot and reaching for the rifle by instinct. Beside the hearth, Little Wolf stirred, but didn't speak. The boy's eyes were open wide and knowing, as if he'd already heard it in the wind. Fletcher moved to the window and parted the curtain. Torchlight. 20, maybe 30 men mounted and armed were encircling the property. Some with rifles slung lazily across their shoulders, others with ropes coiled at their hips like coiled threats. These weren't ranchers. They weren't travelers. These were vigilantes. And, at their center, on a tall chestnut horse, sat Jeremiah Wade, the territorial marshal, with a thirst for war and a reputation for stirring it. Knox, the man's voice cut across the dark like a blade. We know you got that Apache brat inside. Hand him over and no one has to bleed. Fletcher didn't answer. He turned, found Little Wolf standing barefoot behind him, shoulders tense but eyes locked forward. The boy knew. This wasn't about justice. This was about vengeance disguised as order. They want me, the boy whispered. You let me go. Maybe they not hurt you. Fletcher looked at him at the way his tiny fists were clenched like a grown man's. "Ain't happening, kid." The cabin walls were thin. The porch railing wouldn't stop a bullet. And Fletcher had only what ammo he'd stockpiled for coyotes and snakes, not a lynch mob with badges. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst came when Wade spoke again. "That kid's kind has been spying on our wagon routes, probably getting ready for another raid. If we don't send a message now, your town's next." Lies. Fletcher knew the truth. The Apache hadn't broken the treaty in over a year. But facts didn't matter to men who wanted blood. From the other side of the property, there came another sound, hoofbeats, but faster now, louder. A second wave of riders was approaching from the east, cresting the ridge at speed. And for a flickering moment, Fletcher's heart dropped. Had the Apache come early? Had the chief sensed danger and sent his warriors to retrieve the boy ahead of schedule? But when the first rider entered the circle of torchlight, Fletcher saw the glint of a lawman's badge, Sheriff Tom Bradley. And behind him, half the town. Men, Fletcher knew. Storekeepers, farriers, farmers, all armed, but with eyes wide and alert, not bloodthirsty. Bradley dismounted in one smooth motion, hat low over his brow. "Marshal Wade," he called, voice steady as stone. "By what authority are you threatening citizens on their own land?" The tension was sudden and sharp. Wade looked back, thrown. "I have word from the governor." "No, you don't." Bradley cut in. "I do. That boy is under protection as part of the ongoing treaty discussions. Any harm done to him, that's on you." But even as relief began to rise in Fletcher's chest, Little Wolf tugged on his sleeve. "Look," the boy whispered. Fletcher turned. Past the glow of torchlight, beyond both groups of white men, were shadows. Moving, watching, dozens of them. Apache warriors. Chief Standing Bear had come, and he hadn't come alone. Now, on one small stretch of desert, 3 armed forces stood in a triangle of dry fear and hotter tempers. Every hand on a trigger, every breath waiting for someone to twitch wrong. And at the center of it all stood a boy with scars on his back and a war inside his chest. The desert held its breath. 3 groups, each armed, each righteous in their own eyes, faced one another in the flickering half-light. Marshal Wade's vigilantes stood with fingers curled too tight around rifle triggers. Sheriff Bradley's men flanked the opposite side, calm, but coiled, the weight of law pressing into their shoulders. And beyond them, like spirits risen from the dust, came the Apache, silent, watchful, a wave of warriors, led by Chief Standing Bear himself. Fletcher had never seen anything like it. The wind moved, but no one else did, till the chief rode forward. He passed through the curtain of torchlight like a ghost, his horse slow, his posture upright and unafraid. His voice, when it came, was as soft as worn leather, but it carried with terrifying clarity. "White men," he said, "seem very excited about one small boy." Some of Wade's men shifted uneasily. The absurdity wasn't lost on them. A standoff this size over a child not yet tall enough to ride a grown horse. Chief Standing Bear's eyes swept the circle. "Perhaps we talk like people, not animals." Wade bristled, but before he could speak, Bradley raised a hand. "Chief," he said, voice respectful, "these men came here without lawful order. The boy is protected." The chief gave the smallest nod. "He is my nephew. He stole. He will answer to our laws. But he was learning your ways. That was our agreement." Then something no one expected happened. From behind Fletcher's legs, the boy stepped forward. Little Wolf. His steps were hesitant at first, but steady, and his voice, when it rang out across the circle, shook the torches. "I will speak," he said, "for myself." Fletcher turned, stunned. "I am Little Wolf, son of the Wolf clan. I broke sacred law. I ran when I should have stayed, but I was hungry and scared. And this man," he looked up at Fletcher, "he gave me food when I had none. He gave me rest when I could not sleep." He paused, chest rising, hands trembling. "Now I go home, to face the elders. But I ask that this cowboy, this man, speak for me." It was quiet for a long time after. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Standing Bear stared at his nephew, and something in his eyes, hard as flint, only moments ago softened, just slightly. "You ask a white man," he said, "to speak in your place?" "No," the boy replied, firm now, "with me." And then just like that, the wind blew again, as if the desert had decided to exhale. Wade's voice broke the peace. "This is ridiculous," he growled. "A child can't." But the moment he moved toward his gun, everything stopped. Because every Apache warrior drew an arrow, and Sheriff Bradley drew his sidearm. "Marshal Wade," he said coldly, "you are hereby under arrest for endangering a protected individual, inciting violence, and defying treaty law. Drop your weapon." Wade froze. And slowly, rage still boiling in his eyes, he let the gun drop to the sand. The tension snapped like an old rope finally worn through. Little Wolf turned to Fletcher, eyes glassy. "You speak with me." Fletcher, stunned and proud, beyond words, nodded. "All the way, kid?" But the question still hung in the air like gun smoke. Could one cowboy and one scared child turn a standoff of 3 armies into a chance at peace? Dawn crept slowly over the Arizona hills, casting soft light on the dry land still scarred from the tension of the night before. The fire had gone cold, the rifles were holstered, and Marshal Wade was gone, hauled off in shackles, his rage silenced by law and truth. But something heavier remained in the air. Responsibility. Because this wasn't over. Not for Fletcher, and not for Little Wolf. They stood together on the porch that morning, man and boy both exhausted, both changed. Around them, the Apache warriors had lowered their weapons, but stayed close. The lawmen had retreated to the edge of the property, respectful, now uncertain what came next. Only Chief Standing Bear remained near, waiting, watching. The chief stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Fletcher. "The boy has asked for you to speak when he stands before the elders. That is not a small thing, cowboy." Fletcher nodded. He's earned more than silence. The journey to the Apache camp was made in quiet. The desert rolled beneath them, and with each mile the world, Fletcher knew, faded behind him. No more fences, no more barn, just sun wind and a culture he'd only glimpsed in pieces. When they arrived, the elders were already waiting. 5 men sat in a half-circle around a ceremonial fire, their faces weathered with age and years of leadership. Behind them, dozens of tribe members stood silently, their presence a reminder that this was more than a boy's trial. It was a test of whether tradition and understanding could coexist. Little Wolf stepped forward alone. His feet were bare, his head held high. "I took sacred corn," he said plainly. "I fled punishment. I brought shame." He bowed his head, then looked up again, this time not as a child, but as someone stepping into his birthright. "But I did not forget who I was." The eldest of the council spoke. "You asked to be judged not only by our laws, but by what you have learned beyond our land." Little Wolf turned to Fletcher, then nodded. Fletcher stepped forward, unsure whether words would come. But then he looked at the boy, and they did. "When I found him," Fletcher said, "he was starving, terrified, and whipped so raw it hurt me to look at him. But he didn't beg. He didn't steal again. He learned. He took a breath. In one moon, he's shown me more courage, more humility, and more heart than many men twice his size. He knows your laws matter, but he also knows leadership isn't just about following rules. It's about knowing when to bend them to protect the ones who need it most." Silence followed. Then the elder nodded once. "You have spoken. Now we decide." They whispered in their language, heads bowed, the fire crackling between them. Fletcher stood still, sweat running cold down his back. Little Wolf didn't move. Finally, the eldest stood. "The boy will not be punished again." Fletcher exhaled. The elder continued. "He will return to our village and continue his training. But the strength he carries now, it does not come from pain or shame. It comes from knowing there is more than one kind of strength." Chief Standing Bear stepped forward, laying a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "And that," he said, looking at Fletcher, "is what he learned from you." Fletcher's eyes stung. He gave a small nod, too full to speak. For 1 second, the sun hit the circle just right, and it felt like the entire land held still again. But this time, not from fear, from peace. The sun was high by the time the final embers of the ceremonial fire died out. But neither Fletcher nor Little Wolf noticed the heat. Something deeper filled the air now. Stillness, yes, but not the tense kind that comes before a storm. This was the stillness after. The kind that follows resolution. Fletcher stood at the edge of the Apache camp as the warriors and elders slowly dispersed. He watched Little Wolf rejoin his people, not as the trembling, half-starved child who'd collapsed outside a stranger's cabin, but as someone reborn. The boy moved with a new weight in his step. Not heavier exactly, just fuller, as though the things he'd seen and felt had settled into his bones, grounding him in a way no ceremony ever could. Children watched him with curiosity now, not pity. The elders didn't avoid his eyes, they met them. And Chief Standing Bear. He walked at his nephew's side, not in front of him. It was subtle. But Fletcher saw it. Respect. He packed his saddlebag slowly, unsure of how to leave. It wasn't just a matter of turning the horse around. It felt like closing a book you weren't ready to finish reading. And just as he was tightening the last strap, Little Wolf came running across the dust. Fletcher. The boy's voice was stronger now, clearer. You leave without saying goodbye. Fletcher smiled, removing his hat. Didn't figure your people liked long speeches. Little Wolf frowned for a second. Maybe not. But I do. He reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out a carved piece of wood and eagle wings outstretched. Crude, but clearly made with care. For you, he said. So you don't forget what happened. Fletcher took the carving with hands that suddenly didn't feel so steady. I kid. Not for as long as I live. They stood there a moment longer, neither wanting to say the final word, until the boy once again surprised him. When I become chief, Little Wolf said, his voice steady now. I want peace to be strong like warriors, not quiet like fear. Fletcher's throat tightened. That's a good dream. The boy looked him straight in the eye. It's not a dream. It's a plan. And with that, they parted. No dramatic farewell. No tears. Just a nod. A shared understanding between two souls who'd crossed into each other's lives when the world wasn't watching and made it better. Fletcher rode back to his ranch alone, but something followed him. Not a shadow, not a sound. A sense. That somehow one act of kindness had bent the course of two destinies, maybe more. He set the eagle carving on his mantle, not as a trophy, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder of what happens when you feed the hungry, shelter the hurt, and believe in the better parts of even the most unlikely strangers. The seasons changed, but the story stayed. In town, folks still talked about the standoff, how Fletcher Knox stood on his porch with nothing but a kind heart and a rifle he chose not to use. Some called it foolish, others called it bravery. But none could deny this something shifted that day. Not just for the Apache, not just for the settlers, but for everyone who saw how close hate came to winning, and how a boy's voice paired with a cowboy's mercy turned the tide. Fletcher didn't seek praise. He didn't write down what happened or try to twist it into legend. He went back to tending his ranch, fixing fences and patching roofs, quiet things, honest things. But there were changes even he couldn't deny. Apache traders began appearing at the edge of his land, not with suspicion, but with offerings, furs, baskets, smoked meat. Sometimes a nod, sometimes a handshake. Peace had taken root, not in paper treaties or signatures, but in trust built from something far rarer: understanding. Sheriff Bradley visited often. They'd sit on the porch where it all happened, sipping bitter coffee and watching the sun burn the horizon gold. One day Bradley said, "Knox, what you did out here, some folks are starting to call it the start of something bigger." Fletcher just smiled. "I gave a boy bread, that's all." But it wasn't all. 6 months later, a letter came carried by a young Apache messenger who'd ridden through the night. Inside, written in uneven but determined English, were words that struck Fletcher deeper than any bullet ever could I spoke. The elders listened. "I will be chief. I remember what you taught me. Kindness is stronger than fear. You are part of my story now. Your brother across the fire, Little Wolf." Fletcher held the letter for a long time, the desert wind brushing his cheek like memory. He didn't reply with ink. He didn't need to. He just stepped outside that evening, faced the stars above the open land, and whispered something into the sky. You did good, kid. Because in the end, the stories that last aren't the ones about blood and bullets. They're the ones about a man who shared his last piece of bread, and in doing so, lit a path through darkness for a child to find his way home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Legendary West Stories, where every day we bring you true grit, quiet courage, and tales that echo across time. Let us know in the comments, would you have done what Fletcher did? And if you're ready for another powerful tale, click on the next video, where a rancher saves a wounded stranger only to discover he's the long-lost heir to a tribal prophecy.